Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the University of Johannesburg. I'm Professor Peter Alexander, and my colleagues are Dr. Karen Runciman and Boitumelo Mariping. Thank you very much for coming to the launch of our report, which doubles also as this press briefing. This is going to take two parts. First of all, we'll speak for about 15-20 minutes, introducing you to the report. Then there'll be an opportunity for questions. And then afterwards, we want to say a few more things, drawing out the political implications of this report. In our view, a number of people have misled Parliament, and we want to draw that to the attention of the public. So let me start then with some background. Back in 2009, Luke Sinwell, the very tall man standing at the back, and Karen Runciman and myself and others conducted research on a number of major protests which had just occurred. You may remember the big Balfour uprising, for instance. We drew the conclusion that what we were witnessing was a rebellion of the poor, that whilst these protests were largely isolated, they nevertheless had a similar underlying dynamic. And there were very high levels of unrest in a number of places, so we felt that the term rebellion was appropriate. We could also see that the main people involved in this action were those who, at least sociologically, one would regard as being the poor. That is, they weren't workers even if they were part of the working class. So that's the first point that I want to make. Now, we started this research project trying to understand this phenomenon better. I was involved from the beginning with Karen Runciman. Trevor Ngwani soon joined us, and the three of us are planning to produce a book in the near future. With the help of a number of excellent assistants, Boitumelo Mariping and various other people who are around us, now we gathered together what we believe is the largest database of media reports on this rebellion of the poor, and we've undertaken about 300 qualitative interviews all over the country. Now, there was one thing that was missing for us, and that was detailed information about police crowd incidents. So you can imagine my surprise and excitement when at the very beginning of February I opened my computer, and there I found records of more than 150,000 crowd incidents that had been collected by what the police call the Incident Registration Information System, IRIS for short. These measured two kinds of crowd incidents, the one that the police refer to as crowd management peaceful, and those that they refer to as crowd management unrest. About 90% of them fall into the former category. Now, this is a lot of statistics. Nothing has been released by IRIS in the past, and so it provides us with a very important record indeed of what the public order policing and their forerunners have been doing in relation to crowd management. And they allow us to make a number of important points. These statistics cover the period from 1997 to 2013, so 17 years. And they came to us in the form of 36 Excel spreadsheets. Half of them are for crowd peaceful and half of them are for crowd unrest. And there is one spreadsheet for each of those for every year, so that takes us to 34, and then an extra two which aggregate all of that information. Now, we were very fortunate to get this information, partly because the police were willing to cooperate with us, and we thanked them for that, but also they requested that we make an application under the Promotion of Access to Information Act. It would have taken a lot of resources on their behalf to provide this information, so they needed to have that extra encouragement of the use of that legislation, and we were very grateful to the South African History Archive for assisting us in making that application, and the data that we've obtained will be made available to the public on the SAHA website from the end of July. Now, the data that we've got includes these two main classes of crowds that I've mentioned, and then there are a number of columns which give us the information that we want. So for each incident there is an incident number, and then going across these columns, we have the class of incident, that is peaceful or unrest, the province in which it occurred, the place where the incident occurred, the kind of place where it occurred, e.g. a sports stadium, the motive, that is what it was about, a unique incident number, and a series of notes. Now these notes are especially helpful because they are open-ended, they vary in length, but average something like 150 words. So these are the police's own account of what happened in a particular incident. Now the purpose of this briefing is fourfold. Firstly, we want to publicise the fact that this data will be made available to the public, and I've done that. Secondly, we want people to comprehend this data in its own terms. Too many people have rushed to conclusions about what it is that IRIS is measuring, and we want to avoid that, partly because we want to conduct analysis of this data so that we can understand more about protests, but secondly because we recognise that there is widespread misunderstanding about this data, and we want to correct the misapprehensions that have arisen as a consequence. And I'll come to that in a moment. First of all, I want us to look at the relationship of IRIS to public order policing. Then I want to look at the meaning of the word incident, which I want to make clear from the outset is not a protest. Then I want to look at these terms peaceful and unrest to examine what they mean, and that will be followed by Wojtymiło, who's going to look at some examples of the way in which peaceful and unrest are used in the IRIS incident record, looking at the notes. And then we're going to provide some very preliminary analysis of this data to provide you with a few examples of what the data is showing us. Wojtymiło is going to start that by looking at some evidence about provinces, and then that will be followed by Karen looking at motives. And then finally, in the second section, I shall be drawing out the political implications of this information. And I must say at the beginning that this data really provides us with far more questions than answers, and we look forward to other researchers trawling through this information and using it in different ways from ourselves, and I'm sure that there will be many dissertations written on the basis of this data, and we look forward to reading the findings. Right then, let's have a look at this slide. This graph is going to help me explain something about IRIS and its relationship to public order policing. As always on these occasions, it can be difficult to see these things at the back, so let me tell you what the lines represent. The top blue line represents crowd prevention incidents. The second line represents crowd incidents, and here we've amalgamated the peaceful and unrest incidents. So we'll unpack that later on, but keep in mind that peaceful represent 90% of all of these crowd incidents. And then thirdly, we've got that, I don't know what you call that colour, orangey colour, that UJ kind of colour, which represents all of the other incidents. Now the first point about this then is that these records are being captured by public order policing at a local level by uniformed staff, and then they are recorded, they're registered by IRIS nationally, which should be trying to correct any obvious mistakes that exist in that information that they receive. Now, what you can see here is that the public order policing are not only concerned with crowd management incidents, they also undertake a lot of crime prevention incidents of various kinds. This can be supporting other police, for instance, undertaking roadblocks, and there's various other things which we've listed in the report. And you can see that in the early days, in 1997, by far the most important work of what was still then called, what was at that time called public order policing, most of that work was about crime prevention. The number of those crime prevention incidents has gone down over time, but still, if you aggregate the number of crime prevention incidents and the other incidents, they're still the majority. Now, those other incidents include what the police called support, that is, supporting, for instance, bailiffs when they evict people, and they also include what the police referred to as unrest other. And one of them said to me, these are the ones we really don't like. These are the particularly violent incidents often taxi violence, faction fights, and that kind of thing, which is very difficult for the police to handle because they often have to intervene at the very last minute. So that's the general pattern. Now, one thing I want to point out is that you'll see that there's a sharp dip in both crime prevention incidents and crowd incidents, which starts in 2006, it goes down, reaches a deep point of about 2008, begins to come up in the case of the crowd incidents in 2009, and then it goes up from 2010 again. And you might wonder why this dip. And it becomes clear when we talk to the police and we look at the evidence that this is not because the number of events that one might regard as being crowd events has actually declined. It's because the number of public order policing at that stage, called the crime combating units, CCU, the number of people in these crime combating units had been reduced very sharply from about 7,000 when they were known as area crime combating units to under 3,000 as the CCU. And this meant that the SAPS public order policing capacity had been reduced. They weren't able to cover all of the incidents that were occurring, and even when they did, it would look like some of them weren't actually captured by the police. And this is one of the problems with statistics. You really have to understand what they're showing. So you can't read these statistics as showing that there was a decline in the amount of crowd activity, whether it's protests or not, during this particular period. And I think that's valuable for us to keep in mind. And now we're going to have a very massive expansion in the level of public order policing. I would anticipate that just because there are more policing, we'll find that these graphs take an upward trend. So that's the data, and those are the main points I want to make about the relationship between public order policing and Unrest. Now, we have a little montage, is that the right word, of press stories, and we could have had far more of these. We could have had them even from really respectable newspapers like Business Day, but their headlines are not so dramatic as you can imagine. Nice, polite headline, but all of these are conveying the idea that we've had this massive explosion of protest activity, and their information is based upon a misunderstanding of the reports of incidents, which are often understood, all of them, to be protests, and it's based upon another misunderstanding, which is that the crowd unrest incidents are all about violence. And that's what we want to contradict. We want to show you that that reading of the data is quite wrong. We even have this misreading, I think yesterday, from the South African Institute of Race Relations. So the South African Institute of Race Relations also get it wrong. They are also interpreting crowd unrest as meaning violent protests. And it's that we're going to contradict. So let's then go on to the first of these issues. The idea that an incident is a protest needs to be contradicted. That's what we're doing here. Now, the first thing to notice is that the police, in their written reports, never suggest that a crowd incident is a protest. If you look even at ministerial statements over the years, statements from the Minister of Police in Parliament, he refers to crowd management incidents, not protests. And he divides these into peaceful on the one hand and unrest violence on the other hand. Now, there's a problem with the way in which he implies that violent can be equated to unrest, and we're going to come back to that. In the SAPS annual reports, they don't use that word violent. Instead, what they talk about is crowd-related incidents, which they distinguish between peaceful and unrest-related. But the numbers that they give are just about, sometimes always, the same as those of the Minister of Police. So it's very clear that what the Minister is talking about are the figures that appear in the SAPS annual reports. And if we take this a step further back, we can look at the Irish data, which we've been looking at. And the numbers aren't precisely the same. Sometimes they're 1%, 0.5%, or something like that, different from the figures in the annual reports. The annual reports look at financial years, as does the Minister. We're looking at the Irish data, which is dealing with calendar years, and maybe that partly explains some of the differences. Now, in the Irish reports, we're now going back to the core data, the original data that all of this information is based upon. The Irish data itself, the information that the police, the public order policing, are creating for us by capturing that information at a local level, that has just these two incident classes, crowd peaceful and crowd unrest. Now, you don't see there the word protest occurring at all. So the word protest is an invention which occurs somewhere along the line. And sometimes some of your colleagues pick up on the word. It's perhaps a bit more sexy than something like a crowd incident, and it fits in perhaps with public expectations that the level of this protest activity has risen dramatically, and that's drawn obviously from some press reports, some media coverage in the TV and so on. And I don't criticise journalists for covering things in that way. We have to capture the attention of the public. What is a bigger problem is when senior police officers and politicians mislead the public about this information. Now, another reason why we know that misinterpretation is going on is that the police recently sent, through a senior officer responsible for public order policing, recently sent a letter to my colleague Jane Duncan, who is sitting here, and I'm grateful to her for passing it on to us, which listed a number of types of incident, 27 types of incident. And these types of incident, you can find a full list of them in the report, include things like assembly church, assembly music festival. These are not things to do with protests. And then lower down there are things which you might regard as being protest action, things like barricade. I doubt whether a hostage situation is really a protest, it's something different, and a strike, stay away. So this is a mixture of different things that the public order policing and indeed other police are dealing with and registering as crowd incidents. Some might be regarded as protests, many of them are not protests. And then when you look at the Irish data, which we obviously have done here, and Karen is going to be reporting on that, under the motives category, looking at the options, we find options which deal with things like demanding wage increases, sporting events and so on. Again, these are not protests. So if we can look then at the final slide, which I want to address, this takes up that second issue, the idea that unrest equals violence. And unfortunately, the minister has used these two words interchangeably, creating a false impression. But as all of you know, unrest is not a synonym for violence. And if you look those terms up, you won't find them matching. All sorts of synonyms for violence, all sorts of synonyms for unrest, but they don't match. It is a bit confusing because you would think that the opposite of peaceful is violent. It's an antonym. So the way in which the police have presented this data does, I think, create a false understanding just by the categories that are being used. Now, the understanding that we have of crowd unrest, which comes from a senior police officer who's been dealing with this issue for, I think, something like 20 years, is that a crowd unrest incident should be understood as one requiring some form of intervention. Now, that intervention can be of various kinds. It can be a pushback, it can be an arrest, it can be a report on somebody, a docket being opened up, it might be tear gas and so on. Now the police are making decisions about when they intervene, and supposedly their concern is to prevent public disorder. Now an understanding of when public disorder is likely to occur doesn't mean that it's already occurred. It doesn't mean that there's violence already occurring on the street. And it's quite possible for individual police officers under pressure, not necessarily very experienced, to misjudge a situation and to intervene. And in our experience, and indeed the experience of the police, this is often the source of some of the subsequent violence that may well occur. But you can see from this that unrest is not the same as violence. These are two different things. And unrest is defined in terms of what the police are doing. It's not defined in terms of what people involved in some incident are doing. It's defined by what the police do. There may be violence there may not be violence there. But it's defined by what the police do. And contrary-wise, when we talk about crowd peaceful, it means there's an absence of intervention. So crowd peaceful should be seen as being the opposite of crowd unrest in that particular way. Now this understanding which we're confident about, corresponds to a recent document, 2014 document, put out by the police, their national instruction dealing with public order policing. And in this, they distinguish between different levels of threat. The first level of threat is when they expect everything to be nice and peaceful, and they leave this to local police, station police, sometimes metro police. The second level is when they are concerned that there may be something violent, there may be something that's not peaceful, and in these situations, the public order policing is supposed to be in reserve but close to the particular incident that's occurring. And it's only with the third level of threat that public order policing take responsibility themselves. Now, we can't equate level 3, which is a threat assessment, with what happens in practice, but there is an attempt to match these things up, so that if there's an expectation of there being some kind of unrest, then public order policing intervene, and only then. And so what this reminds us of is that in most of these incidents that we're concerned with, public order policing is taking a back seat. Nevertheless, they do record all of these incidents on their own system. So the conclusion then is that we should not interpret unrest as being the same as violence. And with that, I want to hand over to Boitumelo.
Thank you. So I'll be picking up on the discussion from the definition of peaceful and unrest incidents as presented by Peter, and I'll be discussing the practice of assigning incidents as either peaceful or unrest. While the differences between peaceful and unrest incidents is seemingly clear in definition from the POPs police, we found that in practice it's not that obvious. Again, it is important to emphasize that while crowd peaceful is the opposite of crowd unrest, it does not imply that unrest is synonymous with violence. When we reviewed the IRS data, the peaceful and unrest distinction generally held true to the definitions. However, we found that a number of incidents appear to be wrongly classified, which may be a consequence of poor recording or insufficient diligence by the POP staff. So the two examples here are examples of incidents that are classified as either peaceful and unrest. The incident classified as peaceful, which reads, I don't think people at the back will be able to read this, so I'll just read it out to everyone. It says, on 2001, December the 5th, inspector reports having monitored a soccer match between Manning Rangers and Raya Stars at Chatsworth Soccer Stadium. The match started at 8 with plus minus 2,000 spectators in attendance and terminated peacefully at 9:50. No incidents were reported. The incident is classified as peaceful, which is rightfully assigned as peaceful, as no evidence of intervention is reported on. Sporting events such as this example accounts for almost 4% of the incidents reported, and most of them are classified as peaceful, something that Karen will expand on in a bit more detail. The second example, which is under the motive demand wage increases, reads, members of the ACCU, Area Crime Combating Units in Polokwane, performed crowd management duties at Atok Mine, whereby members of Atok Mine workers were on strike for salary increase. No serious incident reported, and the workers dispersed peacefully. This is one of those examples that are questionable in terms of how they were classified as unrest. Based on the details of the incident as captured on the database, it's unclear as to why this incident is regarded as unrest, since there is no mention of police intervention, arrests, or case opened. The last line on the incident report, which reads, no serious incident reported and the workers dispersed peacefully, clearly demonstrates that the incident was peaceful by definition as used by the police, and yet it was assigned as unrest. This is only one example of many other incidents that seem to be incorrectly assigned as either peaceful or unrest. Turning to the next slide. In terms of the distribution of peaceful and unrest incidents in numbers between 1997 and 2013, An overwhelming majority of 90% of incidents were recorded as peaceful, while only 10% recorded as unrest. The totals reveal an early peak in 1998 for both the unrest and peaceful incidents, something that requires close investigation. And after a drop, the total number of peaceful incidents plateaus around 7,000 to 8,000 per year between 2000 and 2003. Peaceful incidents increased significantly, peaking at nearly 11,000 in 2006. This is the year where the crime combating units were introduced and the area units disbanded and number of staff reduced by almost 2/3, from 7,327 to 2,595 in 2006. This means the 703,027 was the number that was recorded in 1995 to 2,595 in 2006. This means that there were fewer numbers of police to respond to incidents. Peaceful incidents, as we can see, reach a new high in 2010, the year of the World Cup, when there is extra work and more staff. We found that unrest incidents were less affected by the reorganization of POPs in 2006, as unrest incidents increased continually from 2007, rising steeply after 2010 and reaching a peak in 2012. This may indicate prioritizing of unrest incidents in light of already stretched numbers of staff. Turning to the proportion of crowd incidents classified as unrest, the total of the 17 years is precisely 10%. However, the balance shifts as the number of unrest incidents increase from around 850 in 1997 to 1,200 in 1998, decreasing progressively from 700 to just over 500 between 1999 to 2003. There's another notable increase in 2004 as nearly 1,000 incidents are recorded by 2005. With another dip in 2008, the unrest figures follow a similar trend as peaceful incidents, with the exception of a decrease by 2013. So far, there are two rather obvious conclusions that the total number of crowd incidents recorded, especially those as defined as peaceful, declined rapidly after the 2006 reorganization, and probably in large measure because of it, and then rose steeply in 2010 as a consequence of the FIFA World Cup. At this point, we cannot claim to offer whole explanations for these trends, but we can begin to describe some of these patterns. So in terms of the provincial distribution of peaceful and unrest incidents, the patterns and proportions are very similar, albeit with slight variations between provinces. The most interesting yet not surprising pattern that we found is undoubtedly the provincial distribution of unrest incidents. It is no surprise to find that Gauteng, being the most populous province, recorded the highest proportion, to 22% of unrest incidents, whereas the Northern Cape, with the lowest provincial population, recorded the least, 4% of unrest incidents. Therefore, following the logic that more people mean more incidents recorded. However, when we calculated the number of incidents per 100,000 people for individual provinces, as shown in this slide, using the mid-year population estimates from Stats SA, a different picture emerges. What becomes clear from this analysis is that the Northwest has significantly higher number of incidents per 100,000 than any other province. As the slide shows, Northwest has a considerably higher number of peaceful incidents per 100,000 people compared to the national averages and provinces which register the highest number of incidents, such as Gauteng and the Western Cape. We also find that while the number of unrest incidents per 100,000 people for the Northwest was relatively consistent with national averages between 1997 and 2006, there was a significant increase in the number of unrest incidents per 100,000 people from 2006 onwards. We believe that these figures might be explained partly by population growth, which was particularly rapid in the Northwest, and by related expansion in informal settlements in the province. We are not sure why this is the case, thus further research is needed. The 2011 census revealed that the Northwest had the highest percentage of people living in informal housing, as it rose to 21.2% compared to the national average of only 13.6% in that year. I will end here and hand over to Karen, who will be discussing details relating to the assignment of motive options on the IRIS database.
Motives are assigned to incidents from a drop-down menu. So between 1997 and 2008, POPs policing had 60 motive options to choose from, and in 2009 there was clearly a bit of a reorganisation of the motive categories. Some were retired, new categories were brought in, and that rose to 72 motive options. Now the number of motive options presents us with a number of difficulties which I'll go through, but one of the main difficulties is the high number of motives disaggregates the data, making it difficult to make assessments as to what are the main kinds of motives behind incidents. Indeed, although there are these 72 motives in total, only 28 of them have been used for more than 1% of all incidents recorded. A further problem is for the whole period between 1997 and 2013, 34% of them have been assigned no motive registered. Now it has to be noted that until 2013 it was not compulsory for POPs policing to assign a motive. However, even in 2013, 32% of incidents were not assigned a motive. From our analysis of these kinds of incidents that were assigned to the no motive registered category, it's unclear to us why many of them have not been categorised and assigned to a motive. Many of them would have been very simple to assign a motive to. Many of them were soccer matches, church services, and bezos. So it's very unclear to us why these haven't been assigned motives. And again, it creates problems in reading the data, which Peter and my colleague Tumi have alluded to. And we think this creates a problem because the accurate recording of motives is important for public accountability of the police. And many of the motive options are obscure in their meaning. For example, in sympathy with the oppressed is a commonly used motive option, solidarity and ideological conflict. So I move on to this next graph. This gives an indication of the most commonly assigned motive options once we take the no motive registered out of the equation. You'll see that labour issues do tend to dominate incidents, with demand wage increases and labour dispute accounting for the two top motive options. You'll see this third one, solidarity, is the next one. Now, we're actually unclear as to what this solidarity means. We've conducted analysis on it, and it seems to mean a number of different things. And again, we think this is a problem, that many of these motive options don't have a clear meaning, either in their name or in how they've been applied by the police. So in order to provide a more accurate analysis of what kinds of incidents were being documented within the crowd management database, we had to take an aggregated motive analysis. The methodology behind this is assigned in the report. I won't go through it in detail now. But we undertook an analysis where we aggregated motives into one of 10 categories. These categories are motivated both by what we believe is our expertise in this area of research, what we think is the public interest in this data, but also things that were coming from the data that seemed to be clear. For instance, the transport-related issue was something that we wouldn't have put prior to undertaking this research, but from the data it was clear that this was an important category being documented within IRIS. Having undertaken that research, a number of interesting trends appear. The graph on the left here at the top is the selected estimate aggregate motive categories into the peaceful category as defined by the police. Again, we should just make clear that these terms peaceful and unrest do not equate to peaceful and violence. And the graph here at the bottom is the unrest. So the top graph here, you can see that peaceful incidents tend to be dominated by incidents that are either labour related in some sense or especially from about 2008 onwards, what we've called recreational, cultural and religious events. So these are your soccer matches, it could be a book festival, it could be particularly big church gatherings that are being documented here. So you can see the majority of the incidents that have been classified as peaceful are not protests. These are all other kinds of incidents that public order policing respond to. Turning to the second graph, you can see what happens from about 2004 onwards is what we've called community-related issues begin to grow quite steeply. Now again, it needs to be stressed that this is not protest. What we're counting within this community-related category are all kinds of different incidents that are broadly concerned with community issues. So these could be public meetings being held in a township, in a community hall. They could be, again, they could actually be an MBISO, an official government event that is related to some sort of community issue that could have been classified under this motive. So as you can see, it begins to rise from 2004 and gets to quite a peak in 2012. We don't quite fully understand what's generating this peak, and this will actually be the subject of a subsequent research report that we will be issuing very soon. So at the moment we can't come to any broad conclusions about what's generating that, but we hope to in the near future. So just to summarise what we feel are the key findings and recommendations from this report, it's to say that incidents are not protests. And I think we've made that very clear today. The unrest is not the same as violence, and I think again we've made that very clear. It's also interesting that North West has an exceptionally high number of incidents per 100,000 people. At the moment we have some ideas as to why this might be population growth, but it is an area that needs further research. When we undertook our aggregated motive analysis over the whole period, the majority of incidents classified as peaceful were labour related. And again, looking at the whole period, the majority of unrest incidents classified as unrest were what we're calling community related. Again, it needs to be stressed, not protests. The recommendation that we would make on the IRIS system, based on all the research that we've undertaken, is that if the system is modified, it's very important that clear definitions of categories and options are required to ensure effective, reliable and accurate system of recording of incidents. And this is because we believe it's very much in the public interest that these incidents are recorded accurately so that we can all understand what kinds of incidents police are responding to, and we think it's important for a public accountability.
Okay, so that's the main part of the presentation. Okay, that's the main part of the presentation. Opportunity now for questions, and then we'll come back briefly at the end. Karen there mentioned that we've been undertaking further research, and that will show an estimate of the number of these incidents that are indeed protests, and we'll provide a breakdown of those protests into a number of different categories. And we're hoping that that report will come out as early as next week. We're working on it as fast as we can, and then we'll be able to say how many community protests there have been and how many labour-related protests there have been. Okay, now can I ask for your indulgence, and we take the briefing on until a quarter to 12. Is that okay with you? Okay, so questions then.
So is it just one cop that will be compiling this? Would this be a high-ranking sort of at an incident? Or is it
What happens is at a local level, one of the ordinary POPs police, one of the members of the POPs team, will input the data. They'll capture the data. Now, they're supposed to do this on the basis of a written report that comes from somebody within that particular unit in their vehicle, who's supposed to fill in the form, and then it goes to the person recording the information. I understand that doesn't always happen. And my understanding is that it's felt that it's important that there should be an ordinary uniformed member of POPs who's doing the recording so they can understand the circumstances. So that's entered on a computer, then it goes to IRIS, and then they feed back any problems that they have with the data.
So if he's at a big event, is it still just that one cop?
I think
One
that
to say
the...
is a constable or
Yeah,
something
no,
like
look,
that.
my understanding, if I recall the national instruction properly,
Mhm.
is that particular person who's putting in the information on the computer shouldn't be at the event himself in that particular occasion. So taken away from normal duties, and that this job is then circulates from one to another. Yeah.
I just want to find out the data, about crowd unrest incidents. You say that they are defined by police intervention. Would you conclude that the police, in a way, perpetrate or are responsible for the outcomes? Maybe it was a peaceful protest or peaceful incident, but now the deployment of POP somehow could result in this turning out into something else.
Now, look, I mean, we've looked at this data, and the data don't tell you that information. But the reports that we get from the interviews that we've undertaken suggest that that does happen on a number of occasions. We can't quantify that, but it clearly does happen.
So how many, from the data, can you actually have, is there an indication of how many of the incidents are actual protests?
Karen, do you want to say something about that now?
Yeah.
There is a figure in here. So.
Well, do you want to think of it?
I can't remember the figure, but I think it's something like a rough estimate at this stage. But there is a figure in the report towards the end. It's something like 51, 52%. But quote the report rather than me. At the back in blue.
Yeah, it's fascinating, obviously, the very first, obviously, that we've been hoodwinked about incidents, including protests, etc. I guess most knowledge, in fact, the protest aspect and the political significance of that, but, there's also a serious flaw that's revealed in the integrity of the data itself, mostly because it comes from Iris, right? So do you think that there's a possibility in the future for data perhaps being extracted from, say, protesters themselves?
Well, I don't know. I would personally suspect that the police won't do that. I think it's important for us to understand what IRIS is doing here and why they're doing it. They're not concerned with counting protests, or certainly that wasn't the reason why IRIS was established back in 1992. They're using this as a management tool. They want to be able to monitor the number of incidents so that they can better deal with strategic matters, where to deploy the police, how to deploy them, and so on. And they also want this information so they can make a case for extra resources for public order policing, and that's clearly what's happening at the moment over the past year or so. That's the way in which the IRIS data has been used. Now, the police themselves recognise that this IRIS system is really out of date, and they're going to have to modernise it. They're going to have to reduce the number of motive categories, and so on. So there is an opportunity here for some kind of public debate about the way in which this IRIS system is being used, and we've made a couple of recommendations there which we hope will be taken on board. Yep, Dan?
Yeah, it's just from what it's implied, as you just mentioned now in the report, that the use of this data is being used to justify additional resources and other things. I wanted you to comment on the extent to which from this research, would you believe that is a very conscious and politically motivated action on the part of not just the police, but the politicians who control the police? Because what we can see is it's not just about unrest, it's about secrecy, it's about a whole range of exaggerating threats, exaggerating violence, exaggerating all these things in order to justify clampdowns, in order to justify additional resources, in order to justify legislation that prevents and in fact limits rights. Would you go so far as to say that this puts us in that direction?
Well, let me come back to that at the end, because that relates very much indeed to the points that I want to make in the summing up. Okay, who else? Nobody else.
What's
Okay,
the process overseas with other law enforcement agencies?
I don't know. I do happen to know that in Hong Kong, of all places, they do count incidents, but I don't know how those are broken down, and I can't comment on that. As far as I know, nobody else has had access to this kind of data anywhere in the world. We've never seen it in our research as academics. So this is, I can't say it's a first, but this is certainly something that's very valuable. And I think it says a lot about democracy that does exist in this country, that through this PIE legislation we've had the possibility of looking at this data. I think that there are contradictory trends in terms of democracy, and we'll come back to that in a moment.
I mean, you're releasing everything today. What are you expecting the reception to be like? I mean, it's quite clear that, you know, you're going to probably ruffle some feathers here in terms of what you're releasing here. I'm assuming you're doing it with the hope to better the statistics and narrow it down and help. But I mean, what are you expecting the response to be?
Well, there is that. That's not our first concern. The first concern is to understand protests, but before we can do that, we want to understand what these statistics are about. They're widely used, widely misinterpreted, so we want to clarify what these statistics are about in order that there can be more debate about protests, about statistics, about the way they're used, and in the way in which they are being used at the moment, as we will see in a moment, to put forward a certain argument about the need for extra resources for public order policing. So we hope all of that will happen, and we want other people to use this data. The police have been very cooperative in making the data available, and there are clearly people within the police who would like to see this public debate and this clarification of what the data is about and an updating of the IRIS system. Any others? Yep.
Does the data provide any kind of insight to how the police might have or have managed the xenophobia attacks that happened this season? I mean, which I guess is a follow-on question, which is, do you think they used this data when they were responding to the xenophobia attacks?
I don't know, I've got no evidence about that, but what we can say is that at the time of the 2008 killings, the number of public order police was very low. They'd made a decision to reduce the number of public order police, as we've seen, and then they began to increase it, possibly as a response to that violence, but certainly they were increasing it for increasing the number of public order police, then known as the CCU, for the World Cup.
If I could just add to that, one of the categories we did look at was racism and xenophobia in our aggregated motive categories. And it's clear in terms of crowd management incidents, the numbers of incidents related to racism and xenophobia were very low. Now that could be for a number of different reasons. Partly it may be that also, as Peter explained, what the police have called particularly nasty incidents are not classified under our crowd management, peaceful crowd management unrest. They would be under other and unrest. So it would be, in part, the data doesn't fully cover police responses to xenophobia in terms of what we've analysed, but also that it wouldn't just be public order policing responding to those incidents. So again, you're only going to get a partial picture from this data.
I wanted to take, there's three parts in here. On page 38, you say, stress that incidents reported as dissatisfying service delivery should not automatically associated with protest. 49, you say, increasing number of community-related incidents should not be conflated with protest. And then in 65, you say, unrest and community-related instances should not be conflated with protest. So one of the key things that's coming out here is a lot of different things shouldn't be conflated with protest. And yet a lot of your own research has shown that protests are moving up. So where's the gap? In other words, is it simply not being recorded in the IRS database? Is it simply about attribution, motives, these kinds of things? How is it that we're supposed to understand protest if the information here is saying that you're telling us that the protests are pretty much like not associated with all of these incidents?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear, obviously, from other research, the Bellion of the Poor project we've been undertaking, that there is a rise in the number of protests. And obviously what we've pointed to today in this presentation is, although there is this rise, which we can tell from other kinds of data sets, you cannot attribute IRIS figures and their fatality to protests. And that's what's been clear in saying incidents are not protests. But again, one of the difficulties that we have is the number of motives. You know, this huge number of 72 motives. I can't imagine if I was presented with a drop-down menu of 72 that I would either make the right decision all of the time. So the problem is also in how the data is being captured. All of these different options mean that same incidents can be recorded at least under 5 or 6 different kinds of motives. So that creates problems in the data. But also ultimately, as Peter has said, Iris is there for its own purposes, and it's not there for counting protests. And that's partly why Iris doesn't respond to that. And that's why in our subsequent research report, we can get more into looking at how we have attempted to use Iris to try and understand trends in protests. And I can speak more to that next time.
Okay, I think let's move on then. I mean, just to back up very briefly what Karen is saying, if you looked at that graph that she presented, which has got community-related incidents, now it's quite right, of course, that these are not all protests, but it wouldn't be wrong to infer that a large proportion of these are, and that this would then, and we'll demonstrate it next time, do involve an increased number of protests, of community protests. So what we're saying now, and what we've said previously, are not in contradiction. What we're arguing for is honest accounting, and that the public shouldn't be deceived by the misuse of these statistics. But let me make that point now in relation to these quotes. So I'm sure we've established with you that incidents are not protests, and that protests and unrest cannot be equated. But let's see what various people have to say. So the first quote comes from Lieutenant General Elias Mweli, who is the senior police officer who is responsible for public order policing and for Iris. And when he made this statement to the Portfolio Committee back on the 3rd of September, he was sitting next to General Ria Piega, the Commissioner, who was overseeing the presentation. And what he says is, violent protest action escalated from 1,226 in 2011-12, and then in 2012-13 it is 1,882, and in the last financial year it escalated to 1,907. Now these are the figures for crowd management unrest. They're not figures about violence and violent protest action, so he's wrong on 2 counts. Firstly, these are not about protests necessarily, and secondly, they are not violent necessarily. So here he's just wrong. He's got it wrong, and you can contemplate whether he got it wrong on purpose or whether he got it wrong because he doesn't read his script properly, but he got it wrong. The second quote comes from our President, Jacob Zuma, at his State of the Nation address on 12th of February 2015. And here he says, "We are a democratic state and recognise the community's right to protest. We, however, appeal that these protests should be within the ambit of the law and must be peaceful as stated in the Constitution. The police successfully brought under control 13,575 recorded public order incidents, comprising 1,907 unrest-related and 11,668. Now here, the President moves from protest to incidents without indicating that these are different, leaving the impression that incidents are instances of protest action. He then gives the total for all crowd-related incidents, praising the police for bringing these under control, but 86% of these, according to the police's own figures, were, quotes, peaceful, events like football matches and so on, and did not warrant intervention by the police. Although the statement is framed by reference to democracy, he ends up by implying that all protests must be controlled, limited in some way by the police. Use of the word control is especially interesting because it was the term used under apartheid, replaced by the notion of management in 1997. So the President's statement gives a false impression, but it has anti-democratic implications. Then look at the third example, which comes from the budget speech of the Minister of Police and Nkosazana Nhleko on 15th of May 2015, just a few days ago. And he says the country has witnessed a spike in service delivery and/or community protests for service delivery. Police resources were committed to 14,740 incidents. He's got more recent data than the President. Police resources were committed to 14,740 incidents, of which 12,451 were peaceful and 2,289 turning violent. The fact of the matter is that these protests continue to strain the resources of the SAPS. So here it's very clear what he's doing. The reference to incidents is sandwiched between two references to protests. So we can do nothing other than assume that when he's talking about incidents, he's talking about incidents of protest action. Now, we maintain that in all three cases, the speakers were misleading Parliament. Perhaps they should be given the benefit of the doubt. If we assume they misspoke, then they should explain and apologise. The media certainly assumed that they were talking about protest and violence and report the statement as such. We are sending copies of our report to the Portfolio Committee and urge them to take action. But why should people inflate the figures, leaving a false impression? The statements have been made in the context of a massive increase in expenditure on public order policing, a decision on which had already been taken before this year's budget. The increase is 3.3 billion rand a year, up from 2.7 billion rand a year. And at the Portfolio Committee, the National Commissioner's own contribution, in her own contribution, she said that she wants to top this up by a further 30% on top of the 3.3 billion. This is going to be set aside for an almost doubling of the number of public order police and for expenditure on things like water cannon, stun grenades, tear gas, video machines and so on. So they're going to increase the kind of technological goodies that are going to be employed by public order policing, as well as increasing the number of public order police. Now, this is a lot of money. I'll come in a moment. Now, this is a lot of money, and we hope that one of the results of our report will be to encourage public debate about whether this is the correct response to the increase in community protests. We believe that the generals and ministers cited have exaggerated the scale and violence in order to win support for the enormous increase in spending on public order policing, which has occurred in response to, among other things, the Marikana massacre. Our own research has shown that the main issue in terms of protest is housing. And this issue comes up in different forms. Sometimes the people don't have any housing, sometimes it's about the poor quality of the housing. Now, my calculation shows that 3.3 billion rand is enough for about 200,000 RDP houses. That would triple the number of houses that have been built per annum over the last few years. If we accept General Mawela's figures, his big concern is with this increase of 681 in the number of unrest incidents over that period of 2 years that he deals with. If we divide that 3.3 billion rand between 681, we get 5 million rand. Now, is that what the public wants? An extra 5 million rand per protest? But whether they do or not, we think this is something which needs to be debated. So these police chiefs and politicians have misled Parliament, and we conclude in the final sentence of the report that we are disturbed by the way Irish statistics have been misrepresented, because this has implications for criminalisation of protests, for basic democratic rights, and for the direction of resources away from the poor. And it impacts on our ability to hold our leaders accountable. Yeah.
I think we all know that General Vieja and General Mawela and the police minister have actually no idea of what the police is doing. They have probably partaked in or were part of some unrest, but they never had to work with them. They have almost no insight in what the police, the business of the police. So I'm wondering, is their actions, can it be said that it is deliberate, that it is a deliberate misuse
or a deliberate misleading of the public? Or can it be said that they just don't understand the business of the police and that they have no insight into what Iris is showing them, and that it rather shows the quality of leaders in the police that we have, rather than a deliberate attempt to mislead the public?
We've consciously avoided using the word deliberate, but they are misleading Parliament, and it's for them to say how it is that they've reached this situation where they mislead Parliament. If they've misunderstood the statistics, if they don't understand policing, then that's for them to say, and they can apologise for it. But it's clear they have misled Parliament, and this has implications.
Perhaps I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. The numbers that the different politicians have used, these numbers actually come from the data. And the second part of the question is, I mean, I've done fact checking on politicians, what they say, and sometimes you don't know where to get the numbers from. So are we saying that we can safely assume that these numbers come from their own analysis of the IRIS data? And if not, do they have their own sources, or are they potentially plucking it out of the air? You know what I mean?
The numbers come from
From the IRIS.
well, they come from the SAPS annual reports. So they're precisely the same as the ones that appear in the SAPS annual reports. I mean, there's a figure there which Clerco uses, which I haven't seen before, but I'm sure we will see when that report becomes available later. All of the other figures are the same as those in the annual report. Now, that annual report derives its statistics from IRIS for some reason that we don't understand. They're not precisely the same as the ones in IRIS, but the categories are very similar, and the numbers are almost exactly the same. So they're deriving their information from IRIS, and then they're misrepresenting it.
So if we were, each person in this room went away and trawled through the data, we could potentially come up with the same numbers as they've used in their statements. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that we would reach very similar conclusions. I mean, we have tried to reformat the data so that it fits in with financial years rather than calendar years, and the IRIS data seems to record just slightly less incidents, but it is slightly less. You know, it's like 5 or 10 a year for unrest, slightly more for peaceful, and that margin goes up and down through the year. So we've no doubt that the IRIS data provides the basis for these figures.
And there's no other, that you're aware of, there's no other source?
No. Yes, at the back.
Yeah, one of the implications to point out is that you have no doubt that the number of violent protests has increased over recent years. But given that we don't actually know from IRIS about what the number of protests are, much less how many of them are violent, where is the data to support this claim that protests have in fact increased?
Well, we'll be providing that information next week. So we hope that you'll come to that briefing, because what we've been able to do is disaggregate this data that we presented today, and we've been able to make certain judgments. Firstly, about which of these incidents are protest. Now, that obviously requires a definition of protest, which we'll be providing next week. And then we break down those protests in a number of different ways. One is to do with what they're about, but another way we break them down is by looking at the way in which they can be grouped into one of three categories. And we're very careful about the way in which we use the word violent. We argue that violence should be understood as in some way damaging property or persons. But we also have a category which we call disruptive. And this would be applied to, for instance, people blockading roads, which doesn't lead to any permanent damage to property and doesn't lead to any damage to persons, and so needs to be understood separately. It may be that it's annoying for people, that they can't drive along the road when they want to, but it's hardly reasonable to describe that as violent. And then we also talk about peaceful. So next week we'll be dividing these incidents into protests and non-protests, and then we'll be dividing the protests into those three categories. Want to? Yeah, I mean, that's really what we're trying to do in this report. But at the same time, we have to understand that the media reported incidents, and we've got the biggest database on this, so we think we're telling a more accurate story. Some of our reports come from very small towns and rural areas and so on. That underreports the number of protests. I mean, as you can understand, you know, journalists can only get to so many of these events, and the value of this data is that it can be used to triangulate our understanding of what's happened. And in fact, the police data will show rather more protests than the media reports. And I suspect even that is going to be an undercount, because the police are going to miss out on protests as well. What's significant here is that a smaller proportion of all the protests are violent than is being portrayed in the media, and a smaller proportion of violent than is being portrayed by politicians and senior police officers. I think we should call it a day there, because it's 11:45, and I'm sure you've got stories to file and so on. But can I just thank all of you for coming and for asking your questions and listening to our presentation. We hope you found it interesting, and we're very happy to answer further questions now. Thank you.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.